How's it going? Welcome to a Yonex guide for 2023. The year's wrapping up and all of the Yonex rackets that are here are updated from the last time I did a video. In other words, the EZONE, the VCORE, and the Percept are all new. And I'm a big fan of the Percept series actually. I had some issues. I would say the VCORE Pros all felt too soft, too mushy. They had this sensation of like hot butter when I hit a ball, which sounds really nice, and it kind of is in a pleasure sense, but when I'm actually trying to put some real power behind the ball, that was kind of a problem. So Percept I like better than the VCORE Pros by a lot, and it's actually probably a contender for one of my favorite racket lineups here. In other words, I'm probably most likely to settle on a Percept if I had to pick on a Yonex right now. That being said, I have a lot of good things to say about all of these rackets, and I have played with all of them, pretty much. I've played with most of the EZONEs, although there are way too many EZONEs. That's why I put etc. here at the bottom of this list. They have like EZONE 105s, 110s, SLs. These are all like super light, huge head size rackets that fall into the category or family of EZONEs. I'm not going to be talking about that. I don't think most of the people here are here to buy one of those EZONEs. It just so happens that the EZONE family of rackets is the one that Yonex allocated to appeal to the widest range of people. VCORE's doesn't really have a crazy amount of rackets in the lineup, and the Percept does not either. So I've tried almost all of the VCOREs except the 98 Tour, and I don't remember if I've tried the Plus versions, but I still have something to say about them because they're essentially the same as the 98 and 100, but longer and actually with weight taken out of the head. That's what they do with extended length rackets, by the way, because extending the length actually increases the swing weight so much that these companies feel the only way to make the racket still feel like it's swingable is by reducing weight, and by doing that it helps bring the swing weight back down after bringing it up so much from extending it. So that's all the 98 and 100 Plus essentially are. They're just slightly lighter versions of the 98 and 100 that have been extended. Specifically lighter in the head, which will translate to feelings of instability, I would say, especially in situations like volleys. But this video is not about plus length rackets versus standard length rackets, so I'll probably not talk about that here. But you can safely assume that the plus versions of these rackets are just longer and lighter, and there are consequences to it being lighter and longer. Both good maybe and some bad. So that's all I'll say about the plus stuff. And now the Percept series, I have tried every single one of those rackets, and I have reviews on every single one of those rackets. I actually have reviews on most of these rackets, so if you guys want to go and see those in more detail, cool. I'm not going to leave links for 30 different videos, but you can poke around on my channel or search for my channel and you will be sure to find it. Wow, let's fix this typo, huh? Atrocious. Percept. That's what I had. Was that bothering anybody? I'm sorry. Well, it's better now. It's gone. It can't hurt you anymore. Let's get started. By the way, as is tradition, my last video on this, which was about a year ago, feels like a little longer than that. It's me sitting in front of a webcam just like this. Spectrum, still here. Yeah, same idea. So we're keeping the tradition going. Shoutouts to you if you've seen my last one of these videos. All right, let's talk about the EZONEs. The EZONE has been updated from the last generation very subtly. I think the beams are like a ½ millimeter thicker. I don't want to say that's nothing. It's something. They can definitely write down that it's been something done. But I would probably prefer the more recent EZONEs to the last ones. They do feel a little bit more stable. I'll tell you this though, the EZONE series, in a nutshell, I would say are very powerful, and I feel like the power response is a little bit erratic. Like, I was never fully able to connect with the EZONEs, and this is a common complaint. A lot of people like them, popular racket, but just like too powerful, and sometimes not when you expect. So the ball will just like fly, even though you're pretty sure you didn't hit the ball quite that hard. Or maybe the angle of your racket face was just slightly up more than you intended for it to be, and therefore your ball is now flying over the fence. Like, that's how it felt playing the EZONE. Yes, it's kind of a stiffer racket, but so are so many, right? Like the pure arrows, the pure drives, etc. So the EZONE's probably in that territory of stiffness, maybe a little bit less so. I don't know, it's going to depend on who you ask. Stiffness is so relative to so many things. Yonex rackets also tend to have a more dense string spacing. So if you're stringing these Yonex rackets at the same tension you'd string a Babolat, potentially, and you think they should be strung the same because they're both 16 by 19s, but you're completely unaware that the EZONE 98's drill pattern often almost as dense, if not more dense sometimes, than other companies' 1820s. Which is actually the reason that you rarely find a Yonex 18 by 20. They exist now, but they're kind of rare, and for a while they just sort of weren't a thing. Anyway, that's why. Yonex didn't feel like it was necessary. But with enough demand, companies tend to cave to what the consumers want. Anyway, it's cool. We got some 1820 Yonexes now, but not in the EZONE family. Anyway, EZONE 98 was my racket of choice for a while. My gateway into Yonex was plus length rackets. Long story short, I ended up settling more or less on the 98 for quite some time. The 98 has really good spin potential, surprisingly, more so than the 100. The 100 is more powerful and less spin friendly. Like, it has a really stable racket head that just kind of wants to keep hitting through the ball. It's sort of hard to brush over the ball and get that really whippy topspin. It's just not that kind of racket. I know some people are like, oh, it's 100, it should have better spin, but it's really never that simple. And I feel like it takes a really topspin heavy player to be able to appreciate those differences. So you can take my word for it or not, but I'm just going to say flat out, the 100 is a more flatter hitting racket than the 98. And that's not what I want. I don't want a racket that's more powerful and struggles more to pull a ball back in with topspin. That's how I control my trajectory and my depth. On top of that, the beam is a little thicker, so it feels even a little stiffer. Not really my kind of racket, but it's definitely the racket for some. That being said, the EZONE 98, in my opinion and experience, seems way more popular than the 100. I almost never see an EZONE 100 out there, but every time I see an EZONE, it's the EZONE 98. So that's anecdotal, but again, for whatever that's worth. The EZONE 98 Tour, heavier version of the 98 essentially. It's more stable, definitely harder to swing, more advanced racket, but a lot of the playing characteristics are otherwise the same. Quite spin friendly, still kind of erratically powerful, but perhaps popular still among advanced players. Although a lot of players who are advanced will prefer the 98 to the 98 Tour because they actually want to put their own lead tape and so on the racket. But if you don't want to do that and you just want off-the-shelf more stability, more weight, no lead, EZONE 98 Tour could be a good option for you. 98 and 100 plus, I've actually played with both of them, but again, don't really need to elaborate. They're just lighter, longer versions of their standard length selves, and yeah, I said what I said about plus length rackets. So yeah, that's the EZONE series in a nutshell. Big sweet spot, a lot of power, surprisingly good spin, pretty dense string pattern. I think the densest string spacing of the whole Yonex family. Like, if you take the sweet spot drill density and compare it to the sweet spot drill density of even the 95, the VCORE 95, which is a 16 by 20, you'll still find that the EZONE is more dense. You might find that the Percept 97D, which is an 18 by 20, to be slightly more dense, but honestly, I'm not sure. The EZONE 98 is freakishly dense for a 16 by 19. Just, if you're crazy enough to line up the crosses of a racket and focus on the sweet spot area and compare the spacing between rackets like I have in a bunch of videos, then you might find that observation to be true. Which should go hand in hand with the idea that strings with spacing really close together, this is the thing about rackets feeling stiff, okay? Sometimes the EZONEs are labeled, I think, as stiff by people who are stringing it too high. You know how when you pull strings, say you pull a string at 50 pounds. If there are 5 strings each pulled at 50 pounds, and one racket has 5 of those strings closer together than another racket, then you have a higher concentration of strings pulled at 50 pounds in a smaller area. And that's going to affect how stiff the string bed feels, because the tension you're pulling is more concentrated. You understand? So it's not just that it's a 16 by 19, 16 by 19s with this head size should be strung at a certain tension. You should factor in string spacing. It's really never that simple. I find the tennis community to be so funny because in some ways it's really particular and really obsessive, but then there's other details that aren't necessarily marketed, which have real consequences, such as this. And despite the more obsessive tendency of the average tennis consumer, a lot of these things are completely rejected, ignored, or go completely unheard of. So you heard it here first if you haven't heard it before. String spacing matters just as much, if not more so, than string pattern, okay? String spacing puts string pattern into context, just like head size puts string pattern into context, right? A 95-inch 16 by 19 maybe should be strung a little lower than a 16 by 19 in a 100, right? Similar idea. Anyway, if you get an EZONE, consider stringing slightly lower than you might think that you should. Absolutely the same thing for the VCORE 95. Okay, 16 by 20, pretty dense string spacing, very tension-sensitive racket, pretty good all-around racket. You definitely got to work for the power, but if you put the work in, you'll get it, which is a big difference from the VCORE Pros. I felt like with the VCORE Pros, no matter how much work you put in, you'll just never get your power back after a certain point. There is a more linear relationship with power on the VCORE series, which I liked. You always kind of get what you give. Sometimes the EZONE would give you a lot more than you gave. And I felt like the VCORE Pros would never give what you give, especially after a certain point. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in that sense, the VCORE 95 is kind of unique. Lower power, linear power relationship, 16 by 20 on the smallest head size. I always thought that was funny. They're putting the densest string pattern on the smallest head size of the VCOREs. Really makes that racket stand out. So by far, it's the lowest power option on the VCORE family of rackets. Next is the 98. Definitely a bit more spin friendly, a more typical power response, I would say. And the 100 would take that up even another notch. But just so we're clear, the gap in difference from the 95 to the 98 is quite big. The gap in difference from the 98 to 100 is not quite as big, but it is still a noticeable incremental step in terms of power. 98 Tour, I actually haven't played with it, although I imagine it's a similar thing as with the EZONE. It's kind of the heavier version of the 98, although maybe I shouldn't speak to that with any authority because, again, I haven't quite tried that racket. And the 98 100 Plus, you already know. Longer, lighter, there's consequences to that. VCORE series in a nutshell is a little bit harder to define, partly because the 95 stands out so much for me. Like, it has way less power than the other rackets in that family, so it's also not like a spin monster. Yeah, the VCORE series is just kind of hard to wrap up in a nutshell, but I would say all of them have less power than the EZONEs, and a lot of people feel like they have more spin, although again, it kind of depends on which model you're comparing to which model. It's not just like all VCOREs have more spin than all the EZONEs. It's just not that simple. By the way, quick tip, I really prefer to play with the VCOREs with some leather grip or something. Anything to make those rackets a little bit more whippy, and they're way more playable. So if you're kind of a heavy, whippy topspin player, that can be a really nice upgrade or addition to your VCORE. That's probably something I do to any of these rackets, but especially for the VCOREs. It was kind of hard for me to appreciate the differences of the racket until I did that. So if you're looking for the advanced players type of racket in the VCORE series, I think the only one I can point you to is the 95. I've always felt like the 95s from the VCORE almost feel like they should be in their own lineup a little bit. They just, again, they stand out so much, but it is part of the VCORE family, and you just have to explain how different it is and in what ways. So there you are. That's the VCORE kind of in a nutshell. Let's move over to the Percept. So the Percept is currently the latest and greatest from Yonex, and in my opinion, a massive upgrade from the VCORE Pros. Said this before, but the VCORE Pros were so buttery and so soft, and I gotta say it was one of the best feeling rackets ever. But for me, the trade-off in power was just too much. I hit hard. I do. I hit very hard. And I think the harder you hit, the more you're going to notice how much of the power VCORE Pros siphoned off of the top end. Like, I literally could not get any more power. After about 80 to maybe 85% of my full power, there was no more power from hitting harder. So it's like, why would I even go 100% power on a ball? I might as well just go 85% because I'm not going to actually hit the ball any harder. I might try to hit harder, but it's not going to translate to any more power. So it's really annoying to feel the VCORE Pros kind of turn into like a wet noodle after a certain power threshold. What I'm trying to say is, like, the VCORE 95, I could get more power with the VCORE 95 than I could any of the VCORE Pros. Because the VCORE Pros, after a certain amount of power, just get mushy and noodly. And that was probably the most common complaint I saw from many players regarding the VCORE Pro. Some people might try to make a technique argument or something. It's just not, that's not going to work here. All right. The lowest power rackets of the series, and still, is the Percept, formerly known as the VCORE Pro, okay? So of all the rackets that are going to give you the least power, of course it's going to be that one. That being said, I don't really feel that way about the Percept series. I feel a nice linear relationship to power, kind of like the VCORE 95, but it is different, and it's hard to describe exactly how it's different because the racket plays so differently. But I really like the ways in which it is updated from the VCORE Pros, namely in terms of power. The rackets to me feel a little bit more solid, maybe a little bit stiffer, but again, I would take something stiffer than a wet noodle any day. Wet noodle's just too loose, too soft. So the Percept manages to still be a very comfortable racket, just not too far in the direction of comfort that you no longer have power, or dare I say control. Again, how much control can you really have with a wet noodle? The VCORE Pro is really special in the sense that, again, comfort was crazy, one of the best feeling rackets, but I will say at net, it was very cool to be able to just swallow power. Like, somebody could just serve a ball right at my face, maybe, and I could volley back a perfect drop volley. That's the amount of power that racket could swallow. So that was really cool to have such good touch at the net. But I found it so frustrating to have that level of touch in a racket that's also incapable of blowing an opponent back. Like, how much advantage can I really take of that ability if I can't push my opponent back and then make them scramble to the net for a really good drop shot? Instead, they're not really going to get pushed back from the baseline too much because the racket never had enough power to do that in the first place. So the Percept series has powered all of these rackets up a bit, and all of them feel less mushy than their respective VCORE Pro equivalents. But we also have a new racket in the lineup, which is the 100D. But I'll talk about the 100 first. 100's a pretty comfortable racket. I can't complain about the power that it gets or the comfort that it gets. Honestly, very happy with that racket. I don't really have any faults. I'd certainly pick it personally over any EZONE. I might even pick it over any VCORE. It gets good spin, it gets good power, it has good touch, control, comfort, etc. Generous enough sweet spot. It's not huge, but it's not like super tiny. Yeah, it's a really good all-around racket, but as they all do in the Percept series, it leans in the direction of control and comfort. Compared to the 100D, and this will help put it into perspective, the 100D is one of the lowest launch angle tennis rackets I've ever played in my entire life. I couldn't believe how low the launch angle was. Like, literally nothing I did, and this is coming from a heavy topspin player, nothing I did could really give me any arc on the ball. I could get spin, some, but the launch angle was always laser low, which is kind of cool, but it's not really the type of tennis I want to play. I don't think that's going to be a super popular racket. I think it might catch some eyes because it's a new and exotic string pattern, 18 by 19, in this new and exciting Yonex lineup. But it's just not a play style that most people are going to lean into or already have. So I wonder how that racket's going to do. Everything I just said about the racket is commonly what I see. Now, stupidly, for some reason, I thought this racket was going to be pretty good with its spin potential. I don't know why I thought that. Maybe because there's other 18 by 19s I've hit with that have pretty darn good spin potential. And I was thinking about how the 97D from before, remember when they called it like the 97HD, and HD was supposed to stand for high density, and then they had the H, which was supposed to be heavy? I think they just had some sloppy naming with the VCORE Pro series for a while. And then maybe they just decided, you know what, we need to start the whole thing over. We just need to call it something else, because we already have VCORE and then VCORE Pro, and then we have VCORE Pro 97 HD and then 97H. Did they also have D then? I don't know. It was messy times. Anyway, I thought the 100D would somehow be a lot more spin friendly than the 97D from before, and I don't think it was. It also felt pretty stiff. I don't know why. Honestly, kind of a strange racket. I don't really know what to say about it. It had decent plow through, although it wasn't great. And again, spin potential's okay, but the launch angle's super low. It feels like your only options for hitting a ball are just hitting through the court, low over the net. Kind of a one-dimensional play style. You'll be able to do whatever, of course, if you're advanced enough, but it's like you'll be fighting the racket the whole time. There's really only one kind of ball it feels like that racket wants to hit. So that's the 100D. It kind of reminds me of how the Pure Strike 1820 wants to play, but it feels way stiffer than the Pure Strike 1820. The 97D is actually really cool. That also might be one of my favorites from the Percept lineup. There's a few I really like. They're all kind of, the 97D and the 97 and the 100 are all kind of competing for my favorite of the Yonex lineups, honestly. But the 97D is actually a pretty versatile racket. You can get good spin, it has good plow, good control, good feel, good touch. It's not too one-dimensional at all. Surprisingly, it has way better spin potential and way better launch angle variety, in my opinion, than the 100D. Even though the 100D has a bigger head size and one less string, the 97D just has way more variability in its playstyle potential. So I would 100% pick the 97D over the 100D. The 97H is just a heavy version of the 97. It might as well be called the 97 Tour. I actually don't know why it's not. Looking at all these side by side now. Why is the VCORE 98 the heavier version called the 98 Tour, and why is that also the case for the EZONE 98 and 98 Tour? Why do we have a 97 Percept and then a 97H? Why? Why are we doing that? I don't know. I'm just asking the questions. I don't have the answers. And yeah, with that being said, the 97H is a 97 that is heavier. Well, I should probably talk about the 97 then, huh? So the 97, definitely more spin and higher launch angle and easier power and possibly more comfort than the 97D. Yeah, another really cool racket, very versatile in how it plays, leans in the direction of control and touch, but again, not too far in that direction where it's just a wet, weak noodle I gotta say, anyone that really felt that way about the VCORE Pros, that they're all too mushy, anemic, as Tencom might say, shoutouts to One Punch Man. If you felt really strongly about the VCORE Pros, I'd give the Percept a chance. It's not just another VCORE Pro. It kind of feels like the appropriate response to all the complaints that I had about the VCORE Pro, which was obviously the correct opinion if I'm happy with all the changes they made. Pretending like my critiques influenced Yonex to fix all the problems with the VCORE Pros. Yeah, probably not the case, but I think word somehow got around to Yonex, hopefully. I hope these aren't just racket companies that make something way too something and then over time they just fix it like they knew the whole time that the consumers would complain about this one thing. Probably not, but it's honestly shocking how soft and wet noodle-like the VCORE Pro series felt from before the Percept. It's amazing how wet and noodly those felt, and then to think the VCORE Pros before that were even more soft. Like, what are those rackets even... Are they even made of anything but just sponge and wet noodles? Like, I honestly, it just felt like I was like swinging a towel in my hand at a tennis ball. It was just unbelievably soft. The VCORE Pros before the most recent VCORE Pros. So like, I guess a couple generations ago. Unreal. I see people play with those sometimes and I just don't even know how they do it. I really don't. Kind of rare to see those really dark green VCORE Pros before they came out with the more like retro one with little purple accents. It's funny too because like you'll see old rackets, certain ones, a lot out there. Like there's some pure arrows and pure drives that are from several generations ago. I still see those so often. I almost never see the VCORE Pros from a couple generations ago. Almost never. So yeah, in a nutshell, the Percept rights every wrong about the VCORE Pro. In other words, Yonex took everything that I said about the VCORE Pro into consideration when they made the Percepts. I'm obviously kidding, but I'm saying that I really, really like and appreciate and agree with the changes on the Percept line. Although, do I have mixed feelings about the colors? I don't know. If you see this racket in person, it's kind of a pastel green. It's kind of this like mix between matte and pastel. Pastel meaning it's kind of a faint or faded color, and metallic in the sense that it sort of has a shimmer to it. So it has the finish of something maybe metallic, but the color strength of something more pastel. And that might not be something that translates really well on these digital images. I would say that the EZONE here and the VCORE here pretty much look how they look on a screen in person. The Percepts are a little bit different in person, so I don't know. If you're more likely to think it looks better in person or online, I have no idea. I'm just saying that they probably look more different than the other two rackets would online versus in person, or on a screen versus in person. Nothing like the real world, huh? Alright, is that a satisfactory review? Or should we talk about the fourth racket in the Yonex family? I would be speaking, of course, of the Yonex Regna. Some tell me it should be pronounced Regna, and that may or may not be correct. Let's see here. There's a video of me hitting with the Regna, okay? And you can see it on my channel. Here? There it is. Popular videos. 18K views at this time. Next to me hitting at Indian Wells with the VCORE 98. Oh yeah, VCORE 95 over here. A lot of Yonex stuff. Anyway, it is a much more expensive racket and very hard to get than the other Yonexes, but last time I didn't even talk about it because I felt like it didn't really belong in the conversation because it's so limited and Yonex doesn't really include this racket the same way, you know what I mean? So I had reasons for not really bringing it up, but I feel like it's fair to mention that racket, and at the time of my first video, I never even tried one. Whereas at this point in the video I have tried one, it was the 98. So I'll let you get a quick look at it here. Allegedly these rackets are made to the highest standard of the Yonex factory by the best craftsmen there, using their best materials. And that's probably true. So it costs more, and it's probably with pretty good reason that it does. I don't want to say that this racket is just a complete scam and there's no reason that it costs more. But I'm also not saying that it costing more is going to mean that it's a better racket for you. I think that's pretty irrelevant. So I'll just show you this real quick. All right, you can watch this video on my channel if you want to check it out. I've got it strung here with Restring 0, one of my favorite strings. You can get 10% off with my code, yada yada. And that felt really good at like 47 pounds, if I remember correctly. That was one of the most unique feeling rackets I've ever tried. And it took me a long time to figure out how I could express what it felt like, because I tried to use the spectrum of Yonex rackets to explain it, but it's kind of hard to explain. At this point in time, I might say it feels like something between the EZONE and the Percept, but then that might make you think, so it feels like a VCORE? Well, no, not really. I think the closest racket in terms of how a racket flexes on contact to describe how the racket feels when you hit a ball would probably be the Pure Strike. If you guys have hit with the Pure Strike 1820, maybe even the 16x19, there's kind of a unique flex and a unique bend to it. Although there's something more solid about the Regna or Regna, whatever. I don't know what you guys want to call it. But it has this really unique flex. Like for just the first millisecond, it kind of has like this old school flex, and then it stiffens up real quick. Like it has this nice metallic almost bounce to it. I almost imagine like swinging a sword, and a sword would kind of have this particular flex to it. It's really hard to describe. It does not flex or feel like other rackets. And obviously I've played with a lot of rackets doing this kind of stuff. And a lot of rackets I've played with are sort of stereotyped or labeled as having a more old school feel, a player's feel, old school flex, etc. And I've also played with some old school rackets. This one doesn't really feel like any of that. It's a very, very unique feeling. It's hard to describe the flex, but if you've tried it, if you've tried all these rackets that I'm talking about, like the Percept and the EZONE, and you've tried the Pure Strike, and you really remember how those feel, then I feel like I can use those to describe pretty accurately what it actually feels like and maybe set your expectations within reason. But even then, it's hard to describe. And if I could actually throw the Regna into the mix of Yonex rackets here, that would also be a contender for one of the rackets I would pick. Honestly, I'd pick the Regna over any EZONE. I think I'd pick it over any VCORE. And I don't know if I'd pick it over the Percepts. It would be tough. Again, there'd be like a list of 4 or 5 Yonex rackets where I'd have a really hard time deciding if I had to commit to one. And the Regna's right up there. And that's me putting aside the extra cost, the fact that it's rare and unique and potentially made to a higher quality standard than other Yonex rackets, which is already saying a lot. Putting all that aside, I'm just talking about how the racket plays and how it feels. It would easily be one of my favorite Yonexes. So what's it like? You guys can watch my video to find out more, but in a nutshell, it's very solid. Similar to the VCORE 95 in the sense that it sort of gives you what you give it, but it feels totally different from a VCORE 95. It has this solid, like metallic beam type of flex to it, which again is hard to describe. A lot of rackets that have that old school flex, they kind of flex too much. This one takes just the right amount of that and blends it with other modern flex qualities and potentially some unique flex qualities that I've just never felt before. So it's hard to describe, but the power is good. The power is good, but it's definitely not too much. I felt very connected to the power levels of that racket. Spin potential felt good. I definitely didn't feel like I was stuck in some pattern of low launch angles with no spin. I felt like I had pretty much close to my full range of versatility when it comes to spin. I hit with the Pure Aero 98 now, and that's my racket of choice, and I'd say that the Pure Aero 98 probably gets more spin and does so more easily, but that the Regna is probably a little better at hitting through the ball. Maybe a little bit more control, although control is kind of a weird thing to put a number on, you know? Control has a lot to do with how well you can connect with your racket. And if you take a racket like the EZONEs, I feel like it's hard to connect with those rackets, so it's hard to develop a sense of control. And they're kind of powerful, so if you're just slightly off with what the racket's going to do, you might not know what it's going to do until it happens, and it might be too late. So there's that way of looking at control. But then there's also like some rackets are just so weak that it's hard to overhit anything, and some people consider that to be a good control racket because it's hard to hit too hard. But if you want to hit hard sometimes and you want to be in really good control of your angles and your depth, is a racket that's hard to hit hard with good for actual control? I feel like control should really just be more about connectivity than just a lack of power. Sometimes I feel like people talk about control as though what it really is at its core is a lack of power or something, and that's just, I don't know. Control is just not a great word for describing what people actually want when they use a word like control, in my opinion. So with that being said, I feel like the control was actually very good on that racket, similar to how I feel about it on the Percept. And hopefully as I say that, you have a better understanding of what I mean when I say control. So yeah, Regna's right up there with some of my favorites, along with a few of the Percepts. Yeah, that's how I feel. Yonex has some really great rackets. I think that they set the bar in terms of craftsmanship, and I think the quality control and tolerance control speak for itself. I think Yonex has built a name, especially in the world now that we live in, where there's a lot of forums and consumers are really involved in the conversation and consumers respond to marketing, like YouTube channels pop up, but a lot of people are really busy in the comment sections as well as forums and threads. So in the culture of those platforms where consumers and influencers are having conversations about all these different rackets, I think Yonex has become known for its quality control and its craftsmanship. And I have to agree that it sets itself apart because Yonex, they actually make and manufacture their rackets in the same country. Whereas Babolat is a French company, but they make their rackets in China. And Head, I think, is Austrian, but they make their rackets in China. And Wilson is American, right? But they make their rackets in China. In other words, all these racket companies have some country of origin, but they all make their rackets in China. And Japan is the only one where they actually make the racket in the country of origin. And that country of origin is, of course, Japan. And Japan is probably rightfully so stereotyped for having high quality standards across the board for pretty much everything. I mean, I think it's just in their culture, their train system, the cleanliness of their cities. Everyone there is very punctual and hardworking. This video is not really a commentary on the culture, but my point is that there is a degree of expected perfectionism somewhat in their culture across all aspects, not just manufacturing, but kind of like lifestyle, work ethic, etc. You know, there's a lot of cultural and social pressure, in other words, to conform to some idea of perfection, and that translates to their engineering. Their cars have been known to be extremely reliable, right? Toyota and Honda really upset the car industry with their reliability and their quality control standards, which proved themselves over time. And now brands like Toyota and Honda are some of the first to come up and have been for a long time if you want a good, reliable car. And I think Yonex has built a name for themselves in a similar way. Again, not really a commentary on the culture of Japan. I'm just trying to say that the association of quality that Yonex has for itself, to me, goes hand in hand with the quality a lot of people have come to associate with just Japanese companies in general. Whereas China over the years has been kind of stereotyped as the opposite, right? Like if it's made in China, that was almost an implication that it was cheaply made, poorly made. And I don't want to get into that conversation too much, and I certainly don't want to make the implications that the companies making the rackets in China are of a subpar quality. But gotta hand it to Yonex. I think if you grab a random Yonex off the shelf, it's much more likely to be close to or on spec. In other words, their quality and tolerance variation is much tighter than other companies. I mean, it's pretty easy for me to go to a shop or order some rackets, and if I'm comparing, let's say, a couple of Babolats, I might get two rackets that are like 15 to 25 units in swing weight apart. And they may or may not weigh the same, but if the swing weight is that far off, then it means the balance might be that off, or there's all these little discrepancies that can kind of add up, and I think swing weight is a really good way to measure that. But you gotta have a special tool to do it, which I do. In other words, I'm trying to say that it's impressive that I can grab a Yonex off the shelf, measure it, and then just grab another one, same model off the shelf, and they'll probably be really close in terms of swing weight. Did a video on that recently, actually, so yeah. It's impressive what Yonex has achieved, and I think they have won over quite a bit of the market share just based on the quality and consistency they are offering. And they're able to offer that within the same price bracket that all these other big name companies are selling rackets at. So yeah, good for them. It's impressive. And if you want the creme de la creme, you can get the ever fetishized Yonex Regna or Regna, whatever you want to say it. So there it is. That is my 2023 recap of the current Yonex rackets. I hope I was an effective guide and guru in you understanding the Yonex family of rackets, and that you are now better equipped with knowledge to decide which Yonex racket might be right for you. If you guys want to use my favorite strings of all time, you're going to want to check out Restring Zero or a few strings by Toro Line. And those strings by Toro Line are going to be either Ether Wasabi with Wasabi X in the cross. And I mentioned Restring Zero earlier. I also love Restring Zero with Wasabi X in the cross. So you can check out my links below. You can get a discount. At this time, it's 10% for Restring and 25% for Toro Line. And if you haven't heard me say it before, these strings are genuinely phenomenal, amazing, game-changing. They offer so much snapback that you will experience levels of topspin you might not have thought were possible. And if you're a string breaker like me, you will experience levels of durability that you didn't know were possible. I said earlier I hit really hard. Take, for example, I don't know, a racket like the VCORE 95. Let's say I string it with Hyper G 16 gauge and I play for maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. with my heavy hitting buddies, I'm probably going to break that string within 2 or 3 hitting sessions. Restring 0, ether, etc., all these strings that I just mentioned, specifically these strings by the way, will last me somewhere between 2 and 3 times that long, while simultaneously offering me more spin potential. And that's not even at the compromise of things like feel, tension maintenance, etc. It's just an amazing string. I don't want to talk about it too long here, but really, really, really special string. Tourmaline has several string options, but I want to be very clear that the ones that have a lot of spin and really special durability, it's the ones I mentioned, Wasabi, Wasabi X, and Ether. The rest of their strings, in my experience, will break in about the same time frame as Hyper-G, although I'm testing Enso. Although I had Enso break in the crosses kind of quickly with Restring 0 in the mains, whereas Wasabi X will hold up quite long. We'll see. I only speak on what I'm sure about, or at least I try my best to. So if you guys want amazing, durable spin strings, check out the ones that I listed specifically. Be sure to subscribe if you appreciated the content. I keep things super real, and I only work with companies I actually want to work with. I'm not out here taking sponsors from whoever will take me. I genuinely only bother if it's a company that I think is really on set to do something special. And I think Restring and Tourmaline are making some of the best strings of all time. And I think the fact that they last me 2 to 3 times as long as a string like Hyper-G will is a testament to that. I got more links below. I don't want to talk about that too long for you guys, but I appreciate you listening and I appreciate you watching the video. And if you guys have any questions, just leave them in the comments. I try to answer everybody best I can. And like I said, I have more videos on some of these other rackets that are mentioned here, so you can also check those out. And let me know if you guys have a favorite Yonex racket. Be curious to know what it is. But I know quite a few people are curious about Yonex. They haven't been a huge established big name brand like the others until somewhat recently, so I think there's some curiosity about the brand that's still growing. And it's good to see. Yonex definitely deserves to be in a position of recognition by the consumers. So yeah, good for Yonex. I'm happy to see it. Last but not least, thank you to my supporters who have bought me coffee. If you guys want to support the channel directly, you can buy me a coffee. There is a link for that below, and I will shout you guys out in a future video. How about we cut to a scene of me drinking coffee to wrap things up? Open frunk, bitch. Open front trunk. Close trunk. I went back in because I forgot to put half and half, and it's just not the same without a little half and half.